There was a city once that believed itself eternal. For 5,000 years it stood at the center of the known world, and the world bent around it. It tamed the closest thing this world has to a god, and rode it into battle. It built roads that still exist, when almost nothing else its builders made does. It looked at other people's empires, vast, proud, ancient, and burned them down to salt and ash within a single lifetime. Then, on a single day, a day historians can date with more confidence than almost any other event in this world's history, it ceased to exist. Not gradually, not through slow decline or the grinding attrition of war. In the time it takes to draw a breath, by some accounts less, the greatest civilization the world had ever produced was erased from the earth. The historians who came after called it simply the Doom. What could do that to an empire of dragons? A volcano? A war? A weapon? Or something else? Something the survivors were too afraid to name. Every kingdom that exists in Westeros today, every dynasty, every war fought over a chair made of 1,000 swords, all of it began in the ashes of that single day. This is the story of how the world's greatest empire ended. Why almost no one survived to explain how.
And why, more than a century later, we still are not entirely certain what happened at all. Every civilization that falls leaves behind a reason. Great empires elsewhere in this world's history have their invading armies, their plagues, their famines, their civil wars, causes a historian can trace, argue over, and footnote. Valyria left behind almost nothing at all. No enemy army marched on Valyria's gates. No siege preceded its fall. No declaration of war. No famine crept slowly through its granaries. Whatever destroyed the Valyrian Freehold arrived and departed within hours, and it took with it the very people best equipped to explain what it had been. This is a large part of why the Doom of Valyria remains one of the most debated events in the history of the known world. It is not simply that we lack a definitive account. It is that almost every eyewitness who might have given one died in the act of witnessing it. What survives instead are fragments, second-hand chronicles written by peoples who watched the sky turn red from hundreds of miles away. Court histories composed a century later by maesters, piecing together the testimony of refugees, sailors, and the handful of noble houses who simply happened not to be standing in Valyria that day. And the record of a single family, House Targaryen, who left an account because they, almost alone among the great dragonlords, survived to keep one.
Historians in Westeros still argue about what caused the Doom. They likely always will. But the shape of the catastrophe itself, what happened, if not fully why, is recorded clearly enough to reconstruct. Much of that reconstruction rests on the work of two chroniclers in particular, whose names will recur throughout this documentary. The Archmaester Gildain, whose histories of House Targaryen preserve the fullest surviving account of the family's flight from Valyria, and Maester Yandel, whose broader history of the known world remains the most complete surviving account of the Freehold itself, its rise and its end. Neither man witnessed the Doom. Both were writing generations after it, assembling their histories from earlier chronicles, oral testimony, and the ordinary gaps and biases that affect any historian working centuries after the fact. Where this documentary draws on their work, it does so as the best surviving scholarship available, not as an unimpeachable transcript of events no living historian ever actually saw. That reconstruction is where this story begins, not with the fire, but with the civilization that fire destroyed.
To understand what was lost, we first have to understand what Valyria was. Long before it ruled half a continent, Valyria was nothing in particular. Its earliest inhabitants were shepherds, tending flocks on a volcanic peninsula in the east of Essos, in the shadow of a ring of 14 volcanoes the world would come to call the 14 Flames. They had no empire. They had no dragons. For a very long time, they had nothing that distinguished them from a dozen other small peoples scattered across Essos. Then, according to the oldest surviving accounts, they found something living in the fire. Dragons, it seems, had always denned in the volcanic vents of the 14 Flames, vast winged predators, drawn to heat the way other creatures are drawn to water. What the shepherds of Valyria discovered, and what no other people in the recorded history of this world is credited with discovering, was how to bind those creatures to human will. The chronicles do not agree on exactly how it was done. Dragon horns, sorcery, blood magic carried through jealously guarded bloodlines. The details vary depending on which account you trust and how much of any of it was ever written down honestly. What every surviving account agrees on is this.
Once the Valyrians had tamed dragons, everything about their civilization changed, almost overnight by the standards of history. A people who had been keeping goats were now sitting on living weapons, capable of leveling castles. It is difficult to overstate what that meant. In an age when the height of military technology elsewhere in the world was the sword, the spear, and the siege engine, Valyria possessed something closer to what a later age might call absolute air superiority, and it held a monopoly on it that would last for thousands of years. They used it exactly as you would expect. The people who could ride dragons became the ruling class of Valyria, a group of noble bloodlines, roughly 40 of them at the Freehold's height, whom history remembers as the dragonlords. House Targaryen was one of these 40 families, but crucially, far from the most powerful or celebrated among them. That detail will matter a great deal later in this story. Valyria was not, technically, a kingdom. It had no single king, no emperor. It called itself a freehold, governed, in principle, by an assembly of freeborn landowners. In practice, power concentrated exactly where you would expect it, with the families who owned dragons. Other freeholders had a voice. The dragonlords had the only voice that mattered.
It is worth pausing on this, because it undercuts a comfortable myth about Valyria, the idea of the freehold as some enlightened, quasi-republican civilization, undone by pure misfortune. On paper, freeborn Valyrians governed themselves. In practice, this was an aristocracy of fire, wearing the clothes of a republic. And the distinction mattered enormously to everyone who was not born into one of the 40 families, because it mattered even more to the people who were not Valyrian at all. Valyria's dragonlords bred within their own bloodlines, marrying brother to sister across generations to keep what they called the blood of the dragon pure and undiluted. They were said, by outsiders as much as by themselves, to be strikingly beautiful, hair the color of pale gold or silver, eyes the color of amethyst, a look so distinctive that a person's Valyrian ancestry could often be read on their face centuries after the civilization that produced it had burned. But beauty was the least consequential thing this closed bloodline produced. What mattered more was what the dragonlords believed that bloodline entitled them to. As the freehold grew, it did what empires with an overwhelming military advantage tend to do. It expanded. And where it met resistance, it did not simply defeat its rivals. It made examples of them. The clearest case is the old empire of Gis to the east, once a rival power in its own right, built on its own long tradition of slavery and conquest. Valyria and Gis fought 5 separate wars across the centuries. Valyria won every one of them, and in the 5th and final war, its dragons descended on the Giscari capital itself. The city was destroyed so completely that the chroniclers describe its farmland deliberately ruined against ever-growing food again, its ruins strewn with the skulls of the dead. A monument, daring anyone else to try what Gis had tried. 3 Giscari cities survived that final war, in diminished form.
reduced from citadels of empire to trading ports living under Valyrian shadow, Astapor, Yunkai, and Meereen. It would take thousands of years and events far beyond the scope of this story before those cities answered to no one but themselves again. Having crushed the Giscari, the Valyrians inherited something from them as well, slavery itself. The Freehold adopted the practice wholesale and expanded it, far past anything Gis had attempted. As Valyria conquered further west and south, captives and subjugated peoples were fed by the tens of thousands into the engine of the Freehold's economy, and above all, into the mines beneath the 14 Flames.
Where the Empire's slaves were worked, generation after generation, to draw wealth up out of the same volcanic earth that had made the dragonlords rich in the first place. It is difficult to know, this many centuries later, exactly how many people died in those tunnels. What can be said, with some confidence, is that Valyria's prosperity and its cruelty were not separate stories. They were the same story, told from two different vantage points. Not every neighbor of Valyria went quietly. To the north and west, along the great river the Rhoynar people called their mother, the Freehold met a civilization that fought it for generations rather than years. The Rhoynish Wars, a conflict that dragged on as Valyrian colonies pushed steadily into Rhoynar territory. Its most famous chapter belongs to a prince named Garen. According to the histories and the songs, which do not always agree with the histories, Garen united the fractious Rhoynish city-states behind him and marched 250,000 men against the Valyrian colony of Volantis, further than any Rhoynar prince had dared before him. For a time, it worked. His archers brought down Valyrian dragons in the field, a feat almost no army in recorded history could claim, and the Rhoynar began to believe they could win.
Then Valyria answered, with 300 dragons at once. What followed was not a battle so much as an extermination. Garen's army was burned where it stood. Those who fled into the river found the water itself boiling around them. Garen was taken alive, caged, and forced to watch as his home city was destroyed and its survivors enslaved before his eyes. Here the histories shade into legend, and it is worth being honest about the difference. The singers say that as Garen was mocked in his cage, he called out to the river itself, to the goddess the Rhoynar called Mother Rhoyne, and he begged her to avenge him. That night, by every account that survives, the river flooded without season or warning, and drowned a great many of his Valyrian captors where they stood. A thick, unnatural fog is said to have settled over the ruins afterward, and the Valyrians who breathed it began to develop a disease that hardened and cracked their skin like stone. We know that disease today. Westeros calls it grayscale.
Whether a conquered people's river goddess truly reached across time to curse her enemies, or whether, as skeptics within Westeros itself have argued, grayscale simply already existed in the damp air of that region, and the story of a curse was assembled afterward to explain a grim coincidence, is not a question this documentary can settle. What can be said is that the legend of Garen's curse fed into a larger, older idea that would follow Valyria for the rest of its existence. The belief, held by more than a few of the peoples it conquered, that Valyria's cruelty would one day be answered in kind. That belief would resurface more than once in the centuries still to come. None of this, the dragons, the conquests, the 5,000 years of dominance, ran on fire alone. Valyria built an economy and an infrastructure to match its military reach, and a great deal of it has outlived the Freehold itself. The roads the Valyrians laid across their territories were constructed to a standard that has never been matched since. In parts of Essos, stretches of true Valyrian road remain usable more than a century after the civilization that built them disappeared, running arrow straight across terrain that would defeat most later engineering.
Trade moved along those roads, and along the shipping lanes the Freehold's colonies controlled. Dragonglass, exotic goods drawn from every conquered territory, and above all, Valyrian steel itself,
a monopoly product no rival power could replicate at any price. Valyrian society was, by design, a narrow pyramid. At its peak sat the 40 dragonlord families. Beneath them, a much larger population of freeborn landowners who held the formal rights of citizenship without the power that mattered. And beneath all of them, an enormous population of the enslaved, drawn from every people the Freehold had ever conquered. Their labour built the roads, worked the mines, and staffed the households of the class that owned them. The common Valyrian tongue spread across this entire structure as a language of empire, absorbed by colonists and conquered peoples alike. Which is why, centuries after the Doom, the free cities of Essos still speak dialects descended from it, mutually distinct but recognisably kin. The way the roads themselves still trace the shape of a civilization that no longer exists to claim them. Militarily, dragons were the edge that made Valyria's expansion possible, but they were never the whole of it.
Valyrian armies fielded large conventional forces as well, infantry, cavalry, and in some of the Freehold's eastern campaigns, war elephants drawn from conquered or allied territories. Dragons broke sieges, scattered armies, and made resistance in open battle close to suicidal. The soldiers and colonists who followed behind them were what turned a burned battlefield into a permanent colony. It was this combination, an unmatched aerial weapon paired with an ordinary, well-organized war machine on the ground, that let Valyria hold and administer an empire, rather than simply terrorize one from the sky. By the time its expansion finally slowed, the Valyrian Freehold controlled an empire without precedent. Colonies and tributary cities across most of western and central Essos, connected by roads built to outlast empires, in more than a few cases, including its own. Its wealth was staggering, drawn from conquered mines, captive labor, and monopolies on goods no other civilization could produce. Chief among those goods was a metal that would outlive the empire that made it by centuries, and which no one since has ever fully understood. At the heart of everything Valyria was, its power, its wealth, its magic, and ultimately its destruction, sat a single geological feature. The ring of volcanoes the Valyrians called the 14 Flames. These 14 peaks rose along the Valyrian Peninsula in the east of Essos, and the city of Valyria itself was built in their shadow, threaded between them, on a landscape shaped as much by fire as by human hands. This was not incidental. Nearly everything that made Valyria exceptional traces back to this one volcanic system. It was in the 14 Flames that dragons denned before the Valyrians ever arrived, drawn, as far as anyone can determine, to the heat and the deep volcanic vents, the way other creatures seek out caves. This detail matters more than it might first appear. Dragons are not documented anywhere in the reliable histories as native to Valyria, the way a species might be native to a forest or a coastline. They were found there, already established, by shepherds who had no dragons of their own tradition and no obvious reason to expect any. Wherever dragons ultimately came from, the 14 Flames were, at minimum, a place they had already chosen for themselves, long before any human claimed credit for taming them. The volcanic heat likely explains why.
Dragons are creatures of fire, in every functional sense the histories describe, and a landscape of active volcanoes, geothermal vents, and near-constant subterranean warmth would have offered exactly the environment such creatures needed to nest, to breed, and to thrive, undisturbed, for however many centuries or millennia preceded humanity's arrival. It was here, in that same fire, that Valyrian smiths later learned to forge steel, folded and spelled beyond anything the rest of the world could produce. Valyrian steel, worked with the aid of dragonflame and incantations whose exact nature no living person can now reconstruct. George R.R. Martin himself has confirmed, on the rare occasions he has addressed the subject directly, that the magic of Valyrian steel lay not in some rare ore, but in the forging itself, Spells worked into the metal as it was folded again and again in fire drawn from dragons. That knowledge died with Valyria. Every Valyrian steel weapon that exists in Westeros today, blades like Ice, Longclaw or Blackfire, was forged before the Doom. Not one new Valyrian steel weapon has been made since. Smiths in the free city of Qohor still guard techniques for reworking existing Valyrian steel, reshaping old blades into new forms without losing the metal's strange properties.
But even that is a shadow of what was lost. To make new Valyrian steel from raw iron is, as far as anyone in Westeros can determine, simply no longer possible. The 14 Flames were also quite literally where Valyria's wealth came from. Enslaved labour, drawn from every people the Freehold conquered, was driven into shafts sunk deep into the volcanic rock, extracting ore and rare minerals that fed the Freehold's forges and filled its treasuries. The mountains that made Valyrian magic possible were the same mountains where a great many of Valyria's slaves died, extracting the wealth to sustain it. And it was here, beneath these same 14 peaks, that Valyrian magic reached its outer edge. The histories describe Valyrian sorcery as something practiced disproportionately near this volcanic heart. Blood magic, fire magic, rituals whose purposes survive only in fragments, performed by pyromancers and fire priests who treated the 14 Flames as something closer to sacred ground than simple geography. Later scholars, including, as we will discuss shortly, at least one respected maester of the Citadel, came to believe that Valyrian magic did not simply exist near the volcanoes, it may have been actively restraining them. Geologically speaking, the 14 Flames were never dormant.
They were active and unstable for as long as anyone kept records. A chain of volcanoes, sitting atop what a modern eye would recognize as an extraordinarily dangerous convergence of pressure. The Valyrians did not build their civilization beside a sleeping mountain range. They built it directly on top of one of the most volatile stretches of Earth in their known world. And for 5,000 years, they treated that danger as a source of power rather than a warning. Whether that confidence was earned through genuine mastery, or whether it was simply the confidence of a civilization that had never yet been proven wrong, is a question this documentary will return to. Because on one day, at the end of 5,000 years, the 14 Flames stopped cooperating. Before we reach that day, however, we need to understand the years that led directly to it. Years in which, according to the histories, at least one family in Valyria seems to have sensed that something was wrong, long before anyone could explain what.
By the standards of any other civilization in this world's history, Valyria, in its final decades, should have felt untouchable. It had stood for 5,000 years. It had never lost a war it chose to finish. Its dragons filled the sky over the 14 Flames in numbers no other power could imagine matching. If you had asked almost any dragonlord in Valyria in the years before the Doom whether their civilization might end within their children's lifetimes, they would very likely have laughed at you. That confidence is worth sitting with for a moment, because so much of what follows depends on it. A freehold of 40 rival families, each jealous of the others, each convinced of the strength of their own bloodline and their own dragons. This is not a portrait of unity. It is a portrait of a civilization that had simply never yet been tested by anything it couldn't burn. Valyria's peace was the peace of a power too dominant to be questioned, not the peace of a power that had made itself secure. House Targaryen held no special status in this world. They were dragonlords, yes. The blood of the dragon ran in them as it did in the other 39 families. But they were minor players by Valyrian standards, holding estates in the Freehold itself and further territory in the region called the Lands of the Long Summer.
2 centuries before the events of this section, the family had already established a minor holding of their own, far to the west. A small volcanic island in the narrow sea off the coast of Westeros, garrisoned more as an outpost than a home. It was called Dragonstone. No one in Valyria, least of all the Targaryens themselves,
had any particular reason to think that outpost mattered. That changed because of a young woman named Daenerys, Lord Aenar Targaryen's maiden daughter, whom history would come to remember by a single title, the Dreamer. 12 years before the Doom, in the year 114 before Aegon's conquest, Daenerys was seized by a dream so vivid and so terrible that she could not simply set it aside as an ordinary nightmare. She dreamed, by every surviving account, of Valyria's destruction. The city and the civilization built around it ended in fire. Prophetic dreaming was not unheard of among the old Valyrian bloodlines. Later Targaryens would be recorded having similar visions, true and false alike, for generations to come. What set Daenerys apart was that her father believed her, completely, and immediately, and was willing to act on that belief while it cost him everything a Valyrian lord was supposed to value.
Aenar Targaryen sold his family's holdings in Valyria and in the lands of the Long Summer, gathered his wives, his household, and his dragons, and set sail for Dragonstone. 5 dragons made that journey with the Targaryens, along with 4 dragon eggs besides. Among them, a young dragon who would grow, in the fullness of time, into the largest and most feared of them all, Balerion. It is worth being honest about how this decision was received at the time, because it changes how we should read what happened 12 years later. Abandoning ancestral Valyrian holdings, walking away from the center of the known world, on the strength of a young woman's dream. This was not, by the standards of the Freehold's dragonlords, a mark of wisdom. To many of their peers, it was an act of superstition, bordering on cowardice. A once respectable family fleeing shadows, while their betters stayed and prospered. The Targaryens left Valyria not as celebrated visionaries, but very likely as something closer to a cautionary tale, proof to anyone still watching of how far a noble house could fall by taking a girl's nightmare too seriously. For 12 years, nothing happened. Valyria continued exactly as it always had. Dragons over the 14 flames, slaves in the mines beneath them. 40 families feuding over precedence and territory, as they always had. If anything, those 12 quiet years would have looked like vindication for the skeptics and humiliation for the Targaryens. A family who had thrown away everything for a dream that increasingly looked like exactly that, and nothing more. Then, on a single day, in the year 102 before Aegon's conquest, the 14 flames erupted at once, and the question of who had been right stopped mattering to almost everyone who might have argued about it. There is no surviving account of the Doom of Valyria, written by someone who watched it happen from inside the city. Everyone close enough to see it clearly did not live to describe it. What survives are the testimonies of people who watched from a distance, from ships out at sea, from colonies hundreds of miles off, from the edges of a catastrophe too large for any single witness to take in whole. From those fragments, and from later chronicles that piece them together, we can reconstruct the shape of what happened, even if the full experience of it is now permanently beyond reach. It began beneath the earth. All 14 of the volcanoes that gave the 14 flames their name erupted at once. Not in sequence, not one triggering the next over hours or days, but together, in what every surviving account treats as a single, simultaneous event. For a mountain range that had stood for as long as anyone could remember, tested and unstable, but never like this, it was less an eruption than a detonation. The ground itself did not hold. Chronicles describe hillsides splitting open across hundreds of miles of the Valyrian peninsula. The earth fracturing into chasms that swallowed roads, palaces, temples, and entire towns in the space it takes to say their names. Lakes that had stood for centuries boiled away or turned corrosive. Mountainsides burst outward, throwing molten rock hundreds of feet into a sky that had already gone the color of a wound. It is worth trying, carefully, to imagine what this meant for the people inside it. even though no one who experienced it directly left behind words to describe it. A city built for 5,000 years around the assumption of its own permanence. Its markets, its nurseries, its assemblies still arguing points of law that morning. Given at most minutes to understand that the ground it stood on no longer intended to hold it up. There would have been no time for most of what follows a siege or a war. No evacuation, no warning horns that anyone could outrun. No direction to flee in that the earth itself had not already claimed. Whatever Valyria's final hours actually felt like from inside the city, this documentary cannot recover it, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. And above it all were the dragons. Valyria kept more dragons in the air over its capital than perhaps anywhere else in the world at almost any hour of any day. On the day of the Doom, the historians agree, the fire that consumed the city consumed them too. Creatures whose entire nature was fire, killed by a fire greater than themselves.
It is one of the darker ironies at the centre of this story. The Valyrians had spent 5,000 years learning to survive alongside the most dangerous force in their world. And in the end, that force did not spare them, any more than it spared anyone else. To the north of the peninsula, the devastation took a different, final form. The land did not simply burn there, it collapsed. Entire stretches of coastline dropping away as the ground beneath them gave out, and the sea came rushing in to fill what the earth no longer held up. Where a strait had once separated Valyria's northern reaches from open water, an entire new sea was born in the span of a single catastrophe. The smoking, poisoned expanse that sailors would come to call simply the Smoking Sea. What this meant in human terms is almost impossible to convey through numbers, because so few numbers survive. Of the 40 great dragonlord families who had ruled the Valyrian Freehold, families who had spent generations at the absolute centre of power in the known world, only one still existed, with any dragons left to its name by the time the ash settled. House Targaryen. Safely distant on Dragonstone, watching a disaster none of them had witnessed directly, and few of them, if we are honest about how that final decade had gone, had fully expected.
A handful of other Valyrian-descended houses survived as well, chiefly because they too had already left the peninsula before that day, the Valyrians of Driftmark and the Celtigars of Claw Isle among them, noble families of Valyrian blood who had settled in Westeros generations earlier and simply were not there when the 14 flames erupted. It is a detail that says something uncomfortable about survival in this story. Almost no one who stayed in Valyria lived, and almost everyone who is remembered as having survived the Doom is remembered first and foremost as someone who happened to already be somewhere else. Valyria, the city that had stood at the center of the world for 5,000 years, was gone within a matter of hours. Its libraries, its temples, its treasuries, its assemblies of freeborn landowners who had never really held the power they were promised. All of it, buried, drowned, or burned beyond recovery, along with the overwhelming majority of the people who might have explained in their own words exactly what they had seen. Word of the catastrophe did not arrive at the rest of the world all at once. It arrived the way news traveled, in an age before it could move faster than a ship or a rider, unevenly, first as rumor. Then as the accounts of colonists and sailors who had seen the sky burn from a safe distance and could not fully explain what they had seen, and only gradually as something the wider world accepted as fact rather than exaggeration. For the colonies closest to the peninsula, there would have been no need for messengers at all. The sky itself delivered the news. They left behind a mystery that has outlived every single one of them. This is the question the rest of this documentary exists to take seriously, and it is also the question we can least afford to answer with false confidence. Even within the world of Westeros, among maesters who have spent entire careers studying the Freehold, The doom is described without embarrassment as a catastrophe of unknown origin. No single explanation has ever been established as fact. What follows are the leading theories, not ranked by which this documentary believes, but presented with the evidence and the doubts that accompany each. The first theory, natural catastrophe. This is the most widely held explanation, both among in-world scholars and among those looking at Valyria's geology with an outside eye. The 14 Flames were a genuinely active volcanic system, sitting on ground the histories describe as unstable for as long as anyone kept records. A simultaneous eruption of 14 linked volcanoes, while extraordinary, is not outside the realm of what volcanic systems, sharing a single underlying pressure network, can theoretically do. The supporting evidence is the geology itself. Valyria had always been built on top of danger. The 14 Flames were volatile, even in quiet centuries.
A civilization that mines directly into an active volcanic range for 5,000 years is a civilization gambling every single year that its luck holds. The counterargument is the sheer simultaneity, which is difficult to explain through geology alone. 14 separate volcanic peaks erupting in concert, rather than in the cascading sequence more typical of connected volcanic systems. That is the detail that keeps this theory from being fully settled, even among people who favor it. It is possible. It is not obviously probable. In canon, this is the default, the most commonly cited explanation in world, but it is explicitly not a confirmed one. Even its strongest proponents describe it as the most likely story, not the known one. The second theory, the failure of magical control. A more specific version of the natural disaster theory holds that the 14 Flames were never simply left alone. Notably, Septon Barth, a cleric scholar whose writings on magic are treated with unusual seriousness, even by maesters who distrust religious authority. He, along with a number of maesters, argued that Valyrian sorcery had long been used to actively contain the volcanoes beneath the city, and that whatever spells did so, for whatever reason, failed all at once.
The supporting evidence, this theory would neatly explain the eruption's simultaneity in a way pure geology struggles to. If a single working of magic had been suppressing 14 linked volcanoes for centuries, its failure would produce exactly the kind of unified, single-moment catastrophe the histories describe. The counterargument, it requires accepting a scale of sustained magical control that cannot be independently verified. It rests largely on the authority of the scholars who proposed it, rather than on direct evidence. We know Valyrian magic was powerful. We do not have confirmed proof it was ever used this way. In canon, this theory is attributed to specific, credible in-world scholars, which gives it more weight than folk legend. But it remains an educated theory, not an established fact. The third theory, blood magic and forbidden experimentation. Valyria's dragonlords were not simply tamers of dragons. The histories are consistent, if unspecific, in describing a darker undercurrent to Valyrian sorcery in its final centuries. Blood magic, and experimentation that reportedly extended to reshaping the flesh of animals, and even people, into forms the chronicles describe only as monstrous.
Some historians have proposed that a working of blood magic on an ambitious enough scale, whether an attempt to bind the 14 Flames more tightly, to extend Dragonlord power further, or something else lost with the practitioners themselves, went catastrophically wrong. The supporting evidence, Valyria's own chronicles openly acknowledge a culture of dangerous, secretive magical practice in its final era, practiced by a civilization that had grown accustomed to treating its own power as limitless. The counter-argument, no specific ritual, practitioner, or purpose has ever been identified. This theory explains a plausible mechanism without explaining a plausible event. It tells us what kind of mistake Valyria might have been capable of making, without telling us that this particular mistake was made. In canon, speculative, but grounded in confirmed details about the general character of late Valyrian sorcery, not invented from nothing. The fourth theory, the curse of Garin the Great. This documentary has already told the story of Garin the Great, the Rhoynish prince, whose dying curse is remembered as the origin of grayscale. Some singers and septons extend that story further. They frame the doom itself as the deferred fulfillment of a debt Valyria incurred through centuries of conquest, slavery, and cruelty.
Not Garin's curse specifically, but the broader idea that a civilization built the way Valyria was built does not get to stand forever. The supporting evidence: this is less a documented mechanism than a documented belief. The idea recurs across multiple conquered peoples' oral traditions, suggesting it reflects something more than one isolated legend. The counter-argument: on its own terms, it is unfalsifiable. A curse cannot be measured, cannot be dated, cannot be traced to a specific volcanic chamber. Even in-world skeptics, Tyrion Lannister, among the more famous of them generations later, have argued explicitly that curses like Garin's are simply natural phenomena dressed in story. In canon, explicitly framed as legend rather than history in every source that records it, it is included here not because it is likely to be literally true, but because it shaped how Valyria's contemporaries and successors understood the doom's meaning, whatever its mechanism. The fifth theory, the fire of R'hllor. A smaller strand of belief, associated with worship of the god R'hllor, the Lord of Light, holds that the doom was an act of that god's fire, whether as punishment, purification, or something closer to a natural extension of R'hllor's dominion over flame itself. This theory sits closer to religious conviction than historical argument. Its supporting evidence is thematic, if nothing else. It fits a world in which fire magic and prophecy are demonstrably real forces, not merely metaphors. A detail this documentary's broader story returns to again and again. Its counter-argument: it offers no verifiable mechanism at all, and it is advanced almost exclusively by adherents of R'hllor's faith, rather than by independent historians. In canon, a matter of religious belief, presented here as one perspective among several, not as a claim this documentary treats as probable. The sixth and final theory: sabotage from within. The final theory returns to the 40 families themselves. Valyria's dragonlords were not a unified body. They were rivals who happened to share a city. One line of speculation holds that the catastrophe began not in the earth, but in a deliberate act. Rival dragonlords moving against the pyromancers, or fire mages, responsible for whatever magical safeguards existed around the 14 flames, whether to seize an advantage over their rivals, or simply through the kind of reckless infighting that had characterized the Freehold's politics for generations. The supporting evidence: the Freehold's internal rivalries were real, well documented, and had a history of turning violent. A civilization this fractured was not incapable of destroying itself by accident in pursuit of one faction's advantage over another. The counter-argument: there is no surviving evidence of a specific plot, a plotter, or a motive. Only the observation that the general conditions for it existed. This is the thinnest of the 6 theories in terms of direct support. In canon, unconfirmed and largely speculative. Included because it circulates as a recognized theory among those who have studied the Freehold's final years, not because the evidence for it is strong. What can be said with real confidence after weighing all 6 is this: the Doom of Valyria has never been definitively explained by any source this documentary is permitted to treat as authoritative, and it was very likely never meant to be. The mystery is not a gap in the historical record waiting to be filled. It may simply be the truth of the matter, a catastrophe whose only certain witnesses did not live long enough to be asked. In the days after the Doom, the map of power in the known world did not simply change, it emptied out. Of the 40 dragonlord families who had ruled Valyria for 5,000 years, only House Targaryen remained, with dragons still living and a bloodline still intact. Not because they were stronger, wealthier, or more skilled than their rivals, but because 12 years earlier, one of them had believed a dream, that everyone else had been content to dismiss. It is worth sitting with how strange that is. The family that inherited the last dragons in the world was, by every account of Valyria's internal hierarchy, one of its lesser houses. Not a dynasty singled out by destiny, so much as one that happened to leave early enough, for reasons its neighbours considered faintly embarrassing at the time. Dragonstone itself was no great prize. It was a volcanic island fortress at the edge of the world the Targaryens had known. A minor outpost, not a capital. And Aenar Targaryen is remembered, in at least one account, by a name that says everything about how the move was regarded, even generations later. Aenar the Exile. Whatever the Targaryens had been in Valyria, on Dragonstone, they were, for the first time in the family's history, alone. They were not, however, the only Valyrian blood to survive.
House Velaryon of Driftmark and House Celtigar of Claw Isle, both noble lines of Valyrian descent, both had already settled in Westeros generations before the Doom, and so were simply elsewhere when it came. Neither family kept dragons by that point, but both carried the same silver and violet bloodline the Valyrians had spent 5,000 years keeping pure, and both would remain closely, sometimes intimately, tied to the Targaryens for centuries to come. It is also important to be precise about what the Doom actually destroyed, because it is easy to overstate. The catastrophe obliterated the city of Valyria and the peninsula around it, not every person of Valyrian blood or culture in the world. Valyria's colonies further west, cities like Volantis, Myr, Lys, Tyrosh and the rest, were populated by freeborn Valyrian colonists, their descendants, and the peoples they had conquered and absorbed over centuries. None of that population was in Valyria itself on the day of the Doom. All of it survived, inheriting, in the process, a great deal of Valyrian language, custom and blood. But none of the dragons, and very little of the magic. That last point deserves particular attention.
Magic in the world of Westeros and Essos is widely understood across multiple in-world sources to have grown weaker in the centuries following the Doom. Dragons dwindling, sorcery fading into half-remembered tricks, prophecy becoming rarer and less reliable. Whether the Doom caused that decline directly, or whether it simply marked the moment historians agree to date the beginning of a much longer fade, the timing is not treated as coincidental by those who have studied it. Some maesters have gone further. They argue that Valyria's magic and the world's magic were, in some sense that is never fully explained, the same thing, and that when Valyria burned, so did some of what made magic possible everywhere else. This remains firmly in the realm of theory. What is certain is smaller and sadder than any grand theory of magic. An entire body of accumulated knowledge, 5,000 years of it, simply ceased to exist in any usable form. Spells no one alive still knew how to cast. Techniques like the forging of new Valyrian steel that no living smith could reconstruct. Written histories kept in libraries that had stood since before most of the rest of the known world had libraries at all, reduced to ash, along with the people who might have copied them out one more time.
House Targaryen kept 5 dragons alive on Dragonstone in the years after the Doom. Within a relatively short span of time, 4 of them were dead, through circumstances no surviving record fully explains, leaving a single dragon who had been born in Valyria before the Doom and would live to see Westeros conquered in its name. Balerion, who would come to be called the Black Dread, and who was, for a great many years, very possibly the last living creature in the world who remembered what Valyria had actually looked like before the fire. It is worth pausing before moving on to consider what the years immediately after the Doom must actually have felt like on Dragonstone. Not as the opening chapter of a future dynasty, which is how this story is usually told in hindsight, but as it would have felt at the time. A family that had left the centre of the civilized world under a cloud of mockery now found itself the sole custodian of everything that civilization had been.
with nowhere left to return to, and no elders anywhere else in the world to consult. They were not conquerors yet. They were refugees who happened to have dragons, the last of an entire people, grieving relatives and rivals alike on a cold volcanic rock at the edge of a map that had, almost overnight, stopped making sense.
Everything that came after, the wars, the conquests, the dynasty that would eventually claim a continent, it all grew out of that single surviving bloodline, on that single unglamorous island, at the edge of a world that no longer had a centre. Valyria's destruction did not simply remove a capital, it removed the only authority every colony, tributary, and conquered people across half of Essos had ever known how to answer to. What followed has come to be called, without much need for embellishment, the Century of Blood. Roughly 100 years of war, rebellion, and realignment across Essos, as every power the Freehold had once held together tried to work out, mostly through violence, what would come next. The first city to answer that question was Volantis. Located at the mouth of the River Rhoyne, Volantis was Valyria's largest surviving colony, by a wide margin, and its leaders moved quickly to claim the inheritance the capital had left behind. Volantis declared itself the new capital of the Valyrian Freehold, and demanded that every other colony submit to its authority, precisely as they had once submitted to Valyria's. The other colonies said no. Pentos, Myr, Lys, Norvos, Qohor, Tyrosh, and Lorath. 7 Valyrian colonies scattered across western Essos. Each declared itself independent, answerable to no one, and became what history remembers as the Free Cities. They were joined, unexpectedly, by an 8th city that had never been a colony at all, Braavos. Founded generations earlier in total secrecy by escaped slaves fleeing the Freehold.
Who chose this moment, with the empire that had once hunted them now in ashes, to reveal themselves to the world for the first time. Volantis, furious, went to war to reclaim what it considered rightfully its own. It found itself facing nearly everyone at once. When Volantis moved against Tyrosh, Pentos answered with aid, and the secretive Braavosi sent ships and material support of their own, even though they did not commit to open battle themselves. Myr and Lys rose in rebellion rather than accept Volantine authority. To the north, the fire galleys of Qohor and Norvos, cities founded generations earlier by religious exiles who wanted nothing further to do with the Freehold's tangle of gods, broke Volantine's fleet on the waters of Dagger Lake. Even Westeros became entangled. Argilac Durandon, the Storm King, sent aid to Volantine's enemies from across the narrow sea. Perhaps most consequentially of all, a young Aegon Targaryen, Lord of Dragonstone, in command of the last dragons in the world, and not yet the conqueror of anything. He lent his support to Volantine's enemies as well. Historians still debate his reasoning, since no direct account of his private motive survives, but the timing invites an obvious question.
Whether a young dragonlord, watching Volantis attempt to rebuild Valyria's empire in Essos, had any interest in seeing that empire succeed, when he himself had ambitions of building something new, on a continent no one else was watching quite as closely. Volantis lost. Its armies were broken in the field, its fleets scattered or destroyed, and an expedition it sent east into the ruins of Valyria itself, hoping to reclaim something, anything of the old capital's authority or treasure, simply vanished. No word of it or trace was ever recovered. The Century of Blood did not end with a new empire rising from Valyria's ashes. It ended with 9 free cities, permanently and deliberately independent of one another, none willing to submit to a 10th master ever again. Not every casualty of the chaos survived to become one of them. The city of Issaria, east of Qohor, was overrun by the newly ascendant Dothraki Khalasars during this same period. Its ruins survive today, only as what is now called, grimly, the City of Corpses. This fragmentation is, in its own way, as important a legacy of the Doom as the fire itself.
Valyria had held an entire continent's worth of trade, culture, and power under a single roof for 5,000 years. After the Century of Blood, Essos would never again be unified under one authority.
A political reality that still defines the map of the known world in every account this documentary is permitted to draw on. The instability the Doom set in motion did not fully settle, even after the Century of Blood formally ended. Generations later, 3 of the free cities, Myr, Lys, and Tyrosh, would bind themselves together in a formal alliance, remembered as the Triarchy, or the Kingdom of the Three Daughters, an echo of the same impulse toward consolidation that had driven Volantis a century earlier, though on a smaller and more voluntary scale. That alliance, and the wars that eventually broke it apart, belong to a later chapter of this world's history, but its roots run directly back to the vacuum the Doom first opened.
Where the Valyrian Peninsula once stood, there is now only the smoking sea. And in the more than a century since the Doom, almost no one has gone there and returned to describe it in detail. The sea takes its name literally. Its waters are reported to bubble and smoke, still warmed by whatever violence continues beneath the surface. Poisonous vapors are said to rise from certain stretches, thick enough, by multiple accounts, to kill a sailor outright who breathes too much of them. Ships that round the old Valyrian Peninsula give it the widest possible berth, adding days to a voyage, rather than risk the shorter route through what used to be open water. It is worth noting, in the spirit of intellectual honesty this documentary has tried to maintain throughout, that not every detail of the Smoking Sea's geography comes from fully confirmed sources. Some of what is understood about its formation, that it was once merely a strait, for instance, before the Doom widened it into a sea, rests on accounts of lesser certainty than the central facts of the catastrophe itself. We include it because it is widely repeated among those who study the region, not because it carries the same weight as confirmed history. What is beyond serious dispute is that people continue to try to reach it.
And that very few of them succeed at anything beyond disappearing. More than one expedition from Westeros itself has sailed for the ruins of Valyria in the years since the Doom, and simply never returned. A Lannister king is remembered to have vanished, attempting exactly that, seeking treasures believed lost with the old capital. Generations later, another Lannister, this one searching for a specific ancestral blade lost in the same ruins, found his own crew deserting him in Volantis rather than sail any further east, and was never heard from again either. For those who do approach the ruins and survive, the reports converge on a handful of recurring dangers. The free cities are known to exile their most severely afflicted victims of grayscale into the shadow of Valyria's ruins, sufferers who, over years, are transformed by the disease into what sailors call stone men, skin turned hard and gray as rock, minds largely gone. Dangerous, chiefly because their touch can spread the same affliction to anyone who comes too close. A number of these stone men are reported to survive, in some fashion, amid the wreckage of the old capital itself. Beyond the stone men, the accounts turn openly into legend. Sailors speak of demons in the wreckage,
of things that move in the smoke, that are not stone men, and are not anything anyone can name with confidence. Even pirates, people who make their living operating well outside the reach of law or caution, are said to avoid the Smoking Sea entirely, a detail repeated often enough across independent accounts to suggest it reflects a genuine, widely shared fear, rather than a single storyteller's flourish. Beneath the ash and the poisoned water, by every account, the city of Valyria itself is still there. Its towers, its assembly halls, its harbors, preserved, after a fashion, under more than a century of volcanic sediment. No expedition has ever mapped it in any detail that survives. No one currently living, as far as the historical record shows, has walked its streets and returned to describe them. Whatever Valyria still holds, it has kept
for more than a century now, and shows no sign of giving up easily.
It is tempting to treat the Doom of Valyria as a single, self-contained tragedy. A terrible day, followed by a difficult century, followed eventually by recovery. That is not what happened. The Doom did not simply end an empire. It rewrote the basic rules that every kingdom and city in this story's world would operate under for centuries afterward, in ways that are still shaping events, playing out generations later. Politically, the most immediate consequence was the one already discussed: total fragmentation. Essos, unified under a single authority for 5,000 years, would never be unified again. The free cities that emerged from the Century of Blood remain to this day separate, rival, and often openly hostile to one another. A patchwork where an empire used to be. But the consequence with the longest reach was not what happened in Essos. It was what became possible in Westeros. Before the Doom, House Targaryen was one dragonlord family among 40, a minor branch of a much larger and more powerful whole. Even with dragons of their own, an invasion of Westeros by the Targaryens alone, while Valyria still stood, would have meant picking a fight not just with 7 fractious, ununified Westerosi kingdoms, but potentially with the disapproval or the intervention of 39 other dragon-owning families, who might not have appreciated a junior house acting without the Freehold's blessing. After the Doom, that constraint simply ceased to exist. For the first time in the recorded history of the world, a single family held an effective monopoly on dragons, the only ones left anywhere that anyone could document. No rival dragonlord could contest them, no freehold could recall them. No other power on either continent had ever faced a dragon in battle and lived to develop a defense against one. It took roughly a century after the Doom for a Targaryen to act on what that monopoly made possible. When Aegon Targaryen finally did, the war that followed, his conquest of the 7 kingdoms, was decided as much by that century-old catastrophe in Valyria as by anything Aegon did personally. He did not need to defeat 40 dragonlord families to claim Westeros. He needed only to be the last one standing, and the Doom had already arranged that for him years before he was born. This is, in the end, the through line that connects everything this documentary has described. Aegon's conquest is often told as a story about ambition, prophecy, and 3 siblings with 3 dragons. It is that, but it is also, less romantically, a story made possible by an accident of survival.
A family that left Valyria early enough, for reasons everyone else considered foolish at the time, and so inherited a monopoly on the most powerful weapon in the world, by simply being the only ones left holding it. The consequences did not stop at politics and warfare. Trade routes that had run through Valyria for millennia had to be rebuilt around it, flowing instead through Volantis, through Braavos's growing merchant fleets, through overland roads that no longer led anywhere near the ruined peninsula. Entire economies reorganized themselves around a hole where the center used to be. Religion absorbed the Doom just as thoroughly. For Septons of the Faith of the Seven, the catastrophe became a ready parable about the price of pride and forbidden knowledge, a civilization that delved too deep, in the language some of them still use, and was punished for it. For followers of Relore, it became, for at least some believers, a demonstration of fire's power to judge as well as to serve. Neither reading can be verified as the Doom's true meaning. Both shaped how entire peoples came to understand what had happened and why. And magic itself, across the whole of the known world, is widely understood to have grown quieter in the century that followed. Dragons outside the Targaryen line vanished entirely.
Sorcery that had once been common enough to fear became rare enough to doubt. Whether that fading began with the Doom, or simply became impossible to ignore once Valyria's example was gone, remains an open question.
but almost no serious account of magic's decline in this world fails to mention the Doom, as the moment everything seemed to change. House Targaryen inherited all of it. The last dragons, the deepest wound in the world's memory, and, in time, a continent that had no idea any of this was coming.
For all that can be reconstructed about the Doom of Valyria, a remarkable amount remains genuinely, permanently unknown. This documentary would be doing its subject a disservice to paper over that uncertainty. Some questions may simply never have answers. Could it happen again? The 14 Flames, by every account, are still active. The Smoking Sea did not earn its name by cooling down. Whether the same forces that produced the Doom could recur elsewhere, or even in the same place, is not something any surviving source addresses directly. It is a question geology alone cannot answer, and no one has ever been willing to get close enough to study it properly. What still survives beneath the ash? The city of Valyria itself is believed to remain largely intact under more than a century of volcanic sediment. Its towers, its halls, its libraries, whatever the fire did not consume outright. What exactly that means in practice, whether anything inside could still be recovered, or whether the ruins hold dangers worse than collapse and poison gas, is unknown, because no expedition that has gone looking has come back to report on it in any detail that survives. Are dragons still alive there? This is among the most tantalizing unanswered questions in the entire story, and this documentary has no confirmed answer to offer.
No source treated as reliable here documents a living dragon anywhere in or near the Smoking Sea in the century since the Doom. The absence of confirmation, however, is not the same as confirmation of absence, and the Smoking Sea remains, by design, one of the least explored regions in the known world. What knowledge was lost forever? This much, at least, is not in doubt. The forging of new Valyrian steel, whatever spells bound dragons to specific bloodlines. 5,000 years of written history, magical theory and technique, reduced to fragments, scattered across libraries that were not the one that burned. Some of what Valyria knew may simply never be recovered by anyone, because the people capable of teaching it did not survive to pass it on. Were there survivors history forgot? It is not impossible that some other Valyrian of standing, a lesser dragonlord, a wealthy freeholder, a family with no dragons left to make them notable. It is not impossible that such people escaped the Doom by chance and simply vanished into obscurity rather than into the history books, the way the Targaryens, the Valyrians, and the Celtigars did not. No source confirms this happened. No source rules it out either. Did any dragon eggs survive outside Dragonstone?
The Targaryens are documented to have carried 4 dragon eggs alongside their 5 dragons when they left Valyria, and the family's later history, including generations on, the hatching of dragon eggs long believed inert, shows that Valyrian dragon eggs could remain dormant and potentially viable for a very long time, under the right conditions. Whether any egg was ever removed from Valyria by anyone outside House Targaryen, whether through trade, theft, or simple chance, before the Doom sealed the rest away, is not something any source consulted here confirms, one way or the other. What became of Valyria's freeborn commoners and its enslaved population? This documentary has focused, as the histories themselves largely do, on the fate of the dragonlords. But the 40 ruling families were a small fraction of everyone who lived on the Valyrian peninsula. The freeborn citizens and the enslaved labourers who were not fortunate enough to be travelling, trading, or stationed in a colony that day almost certainly died, in numbers the surviving records simply never thought to count. Their absence from the histories is its own kind of loss, a reminder that the story of the Doom, as it has come down to us, is disproportionately a story about the handful of families who happened to survive it.
Not about the many thousands who did not. And finally, what role did magic truly play? This question returns us to where the investigative heart of this documentary already spent considerable time: the 6 competing theories of causation. None of them confirmed,
none of them entirely dismissed. What can be said in closing this section is only this. The uncertainty is not a failure of research. It is, as far as every source available to this documentary indicates, the actual condition of the historical record, deliberately, permanently incomplete. More than a century after the fire went out, the Doom of Valyria still shapes the world it happened in, not as a closed chapter, but as a live wound that continues to affect politics, faith, and fear in equal measure. Essos remains fragmented into the free cities the Century of Blood produced, their old rivalries, Mir against Lys and Tyrosh, Norvos against Qohor's stranger gods, Bravos' quiet financial reach into everyone's business, all of it still defining the region's politics generations later. Volantis, in particular, never fully abandoned the ambitions that started the Century of Blood in the first place, and would go on, long after this documentary's central story ends, to try again. The fear the Doom instilled did not fade either. If anything, it hardened into law. Generations after the Doom, during the reign of King Jaehaerys I Targaryen, his daughter Aeria defied a standing warning, and flew the dragon Balerion to the ruins of Valyria herself. What she found there was never fully recorded. What is recorded is that she returned gravely, inexplicably ill, that Balerion himself bore strange wounds no one could explain, and that Aeria died soon after, in a manner the surviving accounts describe only as horrifying. In response, Jaehaerys made travel to Valyria punishable by death,
and barred any ship that had visited the ruins from ever docking in Westeros again. That a king would legislate against visiting 100-year-old ruin on pain of execution says more about the Doom's lingering hold on the world's imagination than almost any other single fact this documentary has presented. Valyria did not simply fall. It became something people were formally forbidden from getting close to, generations after there was supposedly nothing left there to threaten anyone. Religiously, the Doom remains a cautionary story, retold in different forms by different faiths, each shaping it to their own theology. Hubris punished, fire made holy, an old debt finally collected. None of these readings can be proven. All of them persist, because a catastrophe this total, with a cause this uncertain, is exactly the kind of event every belief system wants to claim an explanation for. And at the center of it all remains House Targaryen, the family that survived by accident of timing, that inherited the last dragons in the world because 39 other families did not believe a young woman's dream, and that would use that inheritance to conquer a continent none of Valyria's dragonlords had ever seriously considered invading.
Every claim the Targaryen dynasty would go on to make about its own right to rule, the blood of the dragon, the fire that does not burn a true dragon's child, the divine weight of a name that once meant Valyria. Every claim traces back to a single fact this documentary has tried to make plain. They were the ones who happened to leave in time. The dynasty that grew from that inheritance would go on to rule the 7 kingdoms for 3 centuries. And its story? A family defined from its very first surviving generation by fire, by prophecy, and by the memory of an empire it could never fully reclaim, cannot be told without the Doom, sitting underneath nearly every chapter of it. When dragon eggs believed inert for 100 years are later recorded hatching again, when characters still swear by the old gods of the Freehold or fear its name outright, when a Targaryen's claim to a throne is still measured generations on against a bloodline that supposedly runs back to the dragonlords themselves, all of it is the Doom, still audible, long after the fire went out. Valyria's magic was believed to be fading from the world in the century after the Doom. Whether it was truly returning, and what that might mean, is a question that belongs to a different documentary than this one.
But it is not a question that exists independently of the story told here, tonight. Whatever comes after in this story, and a great deal does, begins here, in the ash of a civilization that believed right up until the moment it stopped existing that it would last forever. It is worth returning, at the end of this story, to the question that opened it. What could end an empire of dragons in less time than it takes to tell the story of how it happened? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. We know the shape of the catastrophe, the 14 volcanoes, the earthquakes, the sea rushing in to swallow what the fire didn't take first. We know who survived, almost entirely by accident, and who did not. We know what it made possible, a century later, on a continent whose kings had no idea a dragon even existed until 3 of them appeared over their coastline. What we do not know, and what this documentary has tried to be honest about not knowing, is why the 14 Flames chose that single day, after 5,000 years of restraint, to stop holding back. Perhaps that uncertainty is the truest thing left of Valyria. An empire that prided itself on mastering fire, on binding dragons to its will, on believing itself permanent because it had never yet been tested. Gone so completely, so quickly, that it could not even leave behind a reliable account of its own ending. The dragonlords who might have explained it did not live long enough to try. Everyone who has attempted to explain it since has been guessing.
However carefully, at a truth that burned, along with almost everyone who ever knew it, what Valyria left instead was a world reshaped entirely around its absence, a fractured Essos that never reunified, a single surviving family who turned the last dragons in existence into a continent-spanning dynasty, and a fear of one smoking, ash-choked stretch of ocean that still keeps sailors and kings well away, more than 100 years on. The doom of Valyria was not simply the fall of an empire, it was the end of a civilization, whole enough, old enough, and confident enough that almost no one, inside it or outside it, believed its ending was even possible. Its secrets went into the fire with it, and in more than a century since, the fire has given almost none of them back. What survived was smaller and stranger and far more dangerous than anyone watching from a safe distance could have guessed. A minor house, a handful of dragons, and a dream one girl had 12 years before the world ended, that everyone else was certain wasn't real.